When we lived in California, we had a neighbor who, some months after we moved into this new house, he was living across the street. And this fellow was a bright guy. He was well educated, had worked in a professional job, making really good money over his tenure as in his job, as his career went. And when he finally came to that day, you know that day? That day when you say, I'm done here at this job. He came to that day. And he cleaned up his desk. He came home and he says, man, I'm going to go live it up now. And he took some of his money and he went over to Vegas because we were relatively close to Vegas, and he started gambling. And he kept gambling. And he kept gambling. He didn't lose just his retirement. He lost his house too. Everything. Lost everything he had. Everything he'd ever worked for his whole life. Yeah. Living it up. You know? He took a risk. A bad risk. And it proved too much for him, you know? But sometimes we take risks on good sides of things too. You know, positive types of risks. For example, when I had cancer, I had to make a choice. I had to take a risk. Should I risk on surgery, or should I risk on radiation? What should I do, you know? And I looked at the various data on all of these things, and I took the risk that radiation would be the best treatment option for me. And so far, after 9 years, so good. The Lord is blessed. So we take risks that are bad, and we take risks that can be good, yes? I want to think about Jesus today. I want to think about Jesus. I want to think about Jesus risking for you. Taking a risk for you, for me. What Jesus did for us as he came here to this earth. Was it risky for him to come here? Was that risky for him? Was it possible for him to not be successful? We read today from Matthew chapter 4, didn't we? Take a look at Matthew chapter 4. Matthew chapter 4, beginning with verse 5. Matthew chapter 4, beginning with verse 5. Then the devil taketh him up into the holy city, and setteth him on the pinnacle of the temple. That wasn't a real short building. That was up there. That was way up there. He set him up there on the pinnacle. And the devil saith unto him, If thou be the Son of God, cast thyself down. Now, I have a confession to make right here, all right? I would not be tempted by this at all. This would not be any kind of temptation to me in the least, because I know what I would look like after I took such a risk. I would not look good. It would not end well. This was a temptation only because of the if. Look back at it again. It says, if thou be the Son of God. That was the temptation. It wasn't a temptation to just step off and see what happens. This was a temptation saying, who do you think you are? Do you really think you're God? You really think that you have the right to claim to be the Son of God? Who do you think you are? How tempting it would be for me to answer that question is zero. Because I'm not God, right? I'm not anybody special. This wouldn't have been a temptation to me, but to Jesus, this was a temptation. For him to say, yeah, you think I'm not God? Watch this. You want to see who I am? Let me show you something. That was the temptation. Something that was way beyond me. This was a temptation that we will never face, you nor I. We won't face this because we're not God. We know that. This is not a temptation for us. This was a temptation only for him. Would he live faithfully? Would he live that kind of life? Would he live it up there on the pinnacle? That was the temptation. Would he be faithful to his calling to save us? Not to show off, not to say, here am I, but to say, I came for them. Would he be faithful? Would he live that kind of life? Would he live it up there? That was Jesus' temptation. And that temptation kept coming to him again and again. The temptation to not live God's life, to live that faithful life. Look at Luke. Luke chapter 22. Luke chapter 22. Luke chapter 22, beginning with verse 39. Luke 22:39, and he came out and went as he was wont to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples also followed him. And when he was at the place, he said unto them, pray that ye enter not into temptation. And he was withdrawn from them about a stone's cast, and kneeled down and prayed, saying, Father, if thou be willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but thine be done. Wow. Would Jesus live the faithful life up there on the Mount of Olives? Would Jesus finish the course? Would he drink even that bitter cup? I want you to think about how many sins it would take for you to suffer death. Eternal death. You know, the wages of sin is death, right? How many does that take? 10, 20, a million? How many does this take? One, right? When we break the law, the wages of sin, that's breaking the law, is death, right? If I go out here on this road out in front of our church and I go 100 miles an hour, my little Hyundai, and you know, I'd have to be pedaling really fast. But if I did and the policemen were there, how many times would he say I could do that before he gave me a ticket? Once, right? He's not gonna say, hey, you know, it's okay once or twice, but don't do it 3 or 4. What? No, I could hurt somebody just once, right? Yeah. It just takes one sin to condemn a person to death. And I know this is a shock, but I've got a little bit more than one. I'm sure that comes as a surprise to you. But yeah, it's more than one. A lot more than one. And maybe you have one or two. Or a lot more than one or two. And all of us do. And the whole world does. And all of it fell on Jesus that night. I'm not sure we can grasp the enormity of what he was up against that night. As he fell on his face there and said, Father, if thou be willing, remove this cup. Do we have any clue what it was about? Frankly, I think we don't yet. I think we can kind of, get an idea of it being really big, but I don't think we get it. And the temptation for Jesus as he was there on the Mount of Olives in the Garden of Gethsemane was, would he live it? That life of faith, would he live it up there on the mountain, carrying your sin, my sin? Would he still be faithful to God? Would he still be faithful? In your bulletin, you have a little sheet of paper like this one. Pull that out for me, would you? Then cometh Jesus with them unto a place called Gethsemane, and saith unto the disciples, Sit ye here while I go and pray yonder. And he took with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, and began to be, what? Sorrowful and very heavy. Friends, do we have a clue what that means? Do we have a clue? We're sorrowful and very heavy when we break our toys. Whether our toys are Legos or whether our toys are our cars, our house. You put a hole in the wall. What did you do? Well, I'm sorry. I just opened the door and that little stopper just went through the wall. I'm sorry. Oh, man, that's going to... What? We're worried about a hole that big? Do we have a clue the kind of sorrow that Jesus went through on that mountain that night? Do we have any idea? He began to be sorrowful and very heavy. Do we understand the weight that he was under? Do we know what it was to carry the weight of the sins of the world? Do we have any idea? Oh, but he was God, this was no big deal. He could... What? Was he not flesh and blood like you and me? Was he not able to feel things like you feel them? Sorrow, was it just like, an intellectual thing for him? Or did he understand? Did he feel it to the depths of his being? When it says he was very heavy, did it reach into the core of his being? Yes. Yes, it did. He felt it. He knew it. He understood it. He knew what was coming. Indeed, think about it. As God, he'd never been separated from his Father. But now he was contemplating separation from the one he had been with eternally. Oh yeah. It was more than just our sins. This was breaking an eternal relationship for you and me. Then saith he unto them, my soul is exceeding sorrowful. Can you grasp that? Even unto death. This is the one who was the author of life, contemplating death. God dying for you. Tarry ye here and watch with me. And he went a little farther and fell on his face and prayed, saying, Oh, my Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Would he live it? Would he live the life of faith up there? Nevertheless, he said, not as I will, but as thou wilt. It was here that the mysterious cup, that cup of suffering, trembled. Look at it. It was here that the mysterious cup trembled in Christ's hands. Brothers and sisters, did Jesus go through it for you and I? It's incredible, isn't it? Doesn't it just break your heart what Jesus was willing to do for you and I? Think about it. Think about it. The cup. We think of him as, yes, God, and we're right, he is God in the flesh. But it's in the flesh we need to think about as well. Flesh that trembled. Flesh that trembled at the thought of separation from the Father. Here, the destiny of a lost world hung in the balance. He was taking a risk. He was putting it all on the line. He came there for you and I, and it hung in the balance. This was not totally, in his mind, fully no issue. Oh, no big deal. This was a big deal. This was Jesus risking it for you and me. Laying it all out there. And the question arises, should he refuse to stand as man's surety? Oh man, look what the devil did. Satan encircled his humanity with a horror of great darkness, tempting him to think that God had forsaken him. Remember what Jesus said on the cross? My God, why hast thou forsaken me? He lived it, that life of faithfulness. He lived it up there on the mountain for you and I. Go one more chapter, Luke chapter 23. Luke chapter 23, look at verse 34. Luke 23 and verse 34. Actually, let's go with 33 first. And when they were come to the place which is called Calvary, there they crucified him. We read that word so quickly that we can become flippant about what it even means. Crucifixion? The most horrible way they could come up with to kill a person. And we just say it, oh yeah, he was crucified. What? Think about it. Think of what Jesus gave for you. Think about Him suffering there. He who could just say, I'm done with this, man. I don't need this. I'm out of here. With the blink of an eye, that's all it would have taken. But He lived it, that faithful life. Even up there on the cross. They crucified Him. And the malefactors, one on the right hand and on the other on the left, just to show he was the main bad guy. They put Him in the middle. He could have said, really? You think I'm the bad guy? Psh. How hard it would have been to forgive, like we heard in our children's story. Jesus lived it. The life of faithfulness up on that cross. Indeed, look what it says in verse 34. Then Jesus said, Father, forgive them. Wow. 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 Verse 43. Verse 43. Look at Him living it as the thief looks up to Him. Verse 43. And Jesus said unto him, Verily I say unto thee, today shalt thou be with me in paradise. He's living the faithful life as He's hanging there on the cross, struggling to breathe. He takes breath to help a thief next to Him. Oh man, can you just drink this in? Who this was that gave Himself for you and I. And verse 46. And when Jesus had cried with a loud voice, He said, Father, into Thy hands I commend my spirit. The servant tells us that he couldn't see through the portals of the tomb. In faith, he gives his life into the hands of God. He's living the faithful life. He's living it up there on the cross. Today we celebrate that right here. Today we partake of the emblems that represent the massive sacrifice that Jesus made for you. The life He lived, given for you. So that you could live it here for Him. Today we will celebrate this communion, purchased at such a high cost. We want to live that faithful life for Him. Seventh-day Adventists practice an open communion. If you understand what this really represents, That it's not just, oh, bread and juice, and we do this every quarter. But if you grasp it, you're welcome to participate. We have our foot washing service before this communion, partaking of the bread and the wine, because that's what Jesus did in the upper room with his disciples. And so momentarily we will separate for that. We invite single gentlemen to go down to the fellowship hall, and those couples who will celebrate together who are able, please also go to the fellowship hall. Ladies, single ladies are welcome to stay here at the far classroom on the left side. And couples who are unable to make the journey down there are welcome to celebrate up here in the near classroom. As we come back into this place to partake of these emblems, I invite you to sit quietly, reverently, considering what great sacrifice Jesus has made for you and what it cost him to provide these emblems and this communion for you. Let's separate.